Belhaven. For generations, the never-sleeping city has been both the literal and metaphorical beacon to the denizens of the Prime Expanse as its capital. The high walls that cut the vast metropolis off from all threats or unwanted intrusion were built over so many decades that the laborer who laid the first stone lived to see a grandson born, and that grandson neared his death when the final stone was set. The monolithic realm of modern glory and progress has been the capital of the Prime Expanse for just over 7 centuries. Since that time, the success of the government and the devotion of the Fagar have been the defining factors for every living being within the walls. This is the impetus for the motto by which all in the city is governed: Belhaven, faith, order, industry. For all who live in the city of lights and possibility, structure is never absent, faith is never optional, and advancement is always the chief desire. To look up is to see tall buildings with glowing windows, while trains race along the steamways overhead, carrying precious cargo between factories and middle-class market districts, or racing the wealthy between their pleasurable diversions and their lavish skyward apartments. In the east, the smokestacks belch great columns of ever-present smog that drifts down over the dilapidated surroundings, shortening the lives of the poor and destitute who cling to hope for a better existence. For they dwell in the greatest of all the cities in Zarathis, and life here could not possibly be worse than in any other place. In the west, the spires of the wealthy surround the 2 immense complexes from which all order proceeds. The civic complex, with its magistrate courts, government offices, endless registries, and the seat of the prime paragon himself. And the Sakalamnium, the great divine heart of the Fagar order, with the historical archives, warden armories, endless stained glass halls, and the largest cathedral in Zarathis, in which the masses gather several times each week to receive the blessings of God from those who represent His will within the physical realm. In the high sanctum, the venerable priests of the inner conclave preach their doctrine, serve the needy, and maintain the sort of order that can only come through the most zealous and rigid of faith traditions. Not since the Prime Expanse began has magic been accepted in the walls of this capital, and the citizens of Belhaven do not heed the tragic and haunting tales of the outer cities. The banning of all enchantments and arcane lore holds fast in every way and in every house or place of business in Belhaven. The Void War is ancient doctrine rather than history, the silence an unspoken fiction, and the Sentinels of the Deep Rift a far-off menace that exists only due to the patience and mercy of the powers that be. Each citizen within the walls of the capital dwells secure that they will never see or hear of the arcane as long as they live, and their children may grow into productive, progress-minded people free from the horrors of the beyond. For the authority of the High Sanctum and the Prime Paragon comes from the gun barrels of the Blessed Wardens of Belhaven, the protectors of the realm, clad in hissing armored suits of metal and steam, who stand at each street corner, prosecute justice, and ensure that things in the greatest city in the world continue as they have for the past 7 centuries. Every road is observed, every breath is recorded, every soul is accounted for. All passages are mapped, all movements are noted, all records are kept secure. And so the people move about under their watchful gaze, trading their wares, offering their services, guiding their horses and groxen through the paved streets and cobblestone alleys, dodging the newly invented steam-powered wheeled transports owned by wealthy inheritors, building lives upon the foundation of thousands, the chaos of limitless freedom traded for the security of ordered certainty. Today, it is widely believed both in the city and outside that the horror stories believed as gospel by so many of those on the outskirts are for them alone, and that Belhaven does not participate with the rest of the cities and towns of the Prime Expanse in their whispered retellings of cosmic terrors. But this is not true, and Belhaven's story may be the greatest yet of them all, for it is the ultimate cautionary tale expressed in the events surrounding the downfall of Torvin Mallerwick. In this grand city, a boy named Torvin Mallerwick was born to successful merchant parents in the North Center middle-class ward, the third of 4 children, 2 boys between 2 girls. As a youngster, Torvin was often of a sickly constitution, and much of the time he would have spent playing in the streets with his older brother and their friends was sacrificed for his treatments and indoor rest. In the city, where the best doctors in Zarathus had been educated in the best schools of the age, Torvin's mysterious malady was eventually identified and treated, and he was proclaimed in perfect health by the time he was 15. But years of isolation, what to the boys seemed nothing less than incarceration, had resulted in Torvin's imagination running wild in the direction of the macabre. Often his parents ran to his room to find him screaming, the night terrors accosting him, taking the form of a monster with empty bells for eyes, peering out from within his dark, looming closet, only for him to be drawn into its hostile, hungry embrace against his own will. Invariably, his parents would shut the closet door that Torvin habitually neglected, and over time the night terrors gave way to the boy's inquisitive and ordered mind. The Maloricks nurtured their young son's talents. Thus, Torvin acquired a deep love of facts, statistics, organization, and writing, and his mind was set to use often in his parents' textile shops, which had grown to encompass 5 district enterprises around the North Center Ward. But Torvin's prodigious talents and organization enabled him to move up in the world. Very soon, one of the Maloricks' loyal customers noticed the boy's gifts and offered him a chance at a high-class career in the civic registry, a job that came with an office in the main civic complex and a newly refurbished apartment in the West Wealth District. Though initially reluctant to leave his family and their business behind, Torvin accepted and soon showed his aptitude at research and organization. If numbers were incongruent, Torvin would notice the mismatch. If records showed inconsistencies, Torvin Malorick would be the one to find the source. If documents needed approval seals, Torvin was the man in his office who would ensure that all was in order. Files did not leave his desk without every little detail accounted for, and Torvin rose quickly through the ranks until he had claimed every achievement in his office, becoming a senior clerk of the Civic Registry. The tragic downfall of Torvin Mallowick began not with a mistake of his own, but with that of another, along with his own initiative. One afternoon, as the sun beamed down upon the Silver City spires, Torvin took to assisting his nearby companion, a fellow senior clerk named Davil Tallowglass, with his filings. Among the documents, Torvin came upon a routine death ledger in need of correction. A factory worker from one of the Lowbourne districts, named Edrin Velbach, had perished many years ago, and the death ledger contained both the required doctor's seal and that of the Fagar priest from the man's local sanctum. However, the cause of death listed was an unspecified boiler accident, which had seemingly been scratched out and replaced with mention of some unconsecrated respiratory corruption. Yet even this did not match the third attached correction, which came only in the form of a single scrap of paper attached to the main file that bore the words, "Resolved under Fagar authority." In place of the required seal, a simple stamp was affixed to this final correction, and Torvin's keen eye spotted the thing most out of place. The stamp appeared nearly identical to the seal that ought to have been there, except for one thing. At the bottom, on the banner beneath the symbol of the 3-tongued flame of the Fagar, along with the Order's bannered motto of "What we preserve, what we bind, what we burn," 3 tiny letters accompanied each of the 3 phrases. C.N.S. A strange small bell rang aloud, distinguishable from the many others in the registry office. To this sound of a bell, no manager came running to assist, and no one else took notice. To Torvin, the bell mattered not. Rather, this abbreviated mystery was the beginning of his unraveling. For Senior Clerk Torvin Mallowick was a devout follower of the Fagar, as are all who dwell in Belhaven, and for a soul to be marked as unconsecrated was a damning edict. Such souls cast out of the Order's sanctums cannot enter paradise at the end of their days, but are doomed to wander restlessly in the beyond, inevitably set upon and devoured by any one of the incomprehensible horrors that lurk in the space outside of the world's hospitable embrace. In spite of this incongruence, fellow Senior Clerk Davil advised him not to think too deeply about it, as the matter had been clearly resolved by authority far higher than his own. Torvin's superior, Ordan Quill, the manager of the Civic Registry, provided Torvin the same guidance. Yet Torvin's mind was haunted, whether by innate stubbornness or by the need to discern the state of poor Edrin Velbach's soul, and he took the disordered file home, as he often did with work that had not been completed by the end of his long shift at the registry. Reading the file aloud, he committed it to memory before returning to work the next day, and he continued to search for records and documents for any mention of the final state of Edrin Velbach's soul. How had he come to be unconsecrated? Had he performed the proper rites and ceremonies necessary to return to his local sanctum? Who was his local priest, and could he shed some light on the situation? Torvin sought out this priest, Father Heston Stonyvale, and recounted the record to him, inquiring about the state of Edrin's soul at the moment of his death. He showed him the record, reading it to him aloud. Father Stonyvale did not recall the man, nor his standing in the sanctum, for the death had been many, many years ago, and many more had died of the factory accidents since then, and the priest could not be expected to keep track of them all. Dejected, Torvin returned to work, seeking a different way to discover the truth in the meticulous records of the civic registry, undisturbed by Father Stonyvale's seeming indifference. That very day, Torvin found the clue he sought. In looking for any records of the boiler accident on the date of Edrin's untimely death, Torvin discovered a single witness to the event in question, a child who had also worked in the same factory, a young girl named Nell Ashrow. However, any record of her statements had been torn from the page, with an attached note stating, "Child witness transferred. Moral residue contamination. See Ashrow, Nell. File sealed by Fagar authority." Once again, the note was marked with the same ink stamp imitation of the official Fagar seal with the abbreviation CNS. Elated, Torvin told Senior Clerk Davil about his discovery. Davil, however, was not so elated and asked what reason had Torvin for pursuing a matter that had been declared resolved. Though he knew not the resolution, was it not enough that the divine decree of the Fagar was given? But Torvin, eager to show his initiative and perhaps move even higher in his position, would not be dissuaded, and he left his job that day brimming with the joy at the prospect of his continuing investigation. That very night, Torvin's actions bore their first horrifying fruit. For into the holy sanctum of Father Heston Stonyvale stumbled what was left of Edrin Velbach. As he entered, the blood-red consecration seals on the door and walls curled and melted into black residue. The ink from the holy chants hung around the room bled and dripped from the paper, leaving only black stains. With every pew he touched, he left behind corruption, so that those who sat in those pews saw the faces of their long-dead ancestors, thought to have been dutifully consecrated, but screaming at them in horror as the entities from the beyond tore their spirits apart. When Edrin's shambling corpse reached the parsonage where lived Father Stonyvale, dirt and insects spilled from his mouth as he pulled the sleeping priest from his bed, crying out in agony, demanding to know why God had not accepted him into paradise, and why, even at this very moment, his soul was caught in the vast web of some huge devil, drained more and more each day until he should have been used up. The terrified Father Stonyvale could not answer, and the corpse of Edrin Velbach tore his head from his shoulders, leaving him to be found by the next hapless person to wander in. From there, Edrin's black and decomposing remains shambled off to seek out others. The manager of the factory he accused of causing the boiler accident that had claimed his life, the district magistrate who he believed had denied him justice, and his wife who had broken his heart by moving on to marry another man from the sanctum only a week after her late husband's body had been thrown into a mass grave. These all reported sightings of a set of bones with peeling flesh and rag-torn clothes stained black from the grime, creeping around their homes or places of work. Indeed, the factory manager's mangled body was found stuffed into the faulty boiler a few days later, with Edrin Velbach watching as a hideous laugh spilled from his maggot-infested throat. Upon this discovery, a few of the men of the factory seized the remains of Edrin Velbach and chopped him up with hatchets and hammers, burning what was left and ending the threat. It was not until several days later, when the formal request for a replacement priest for the local sanctum came to the Sacralomnium, that anyone outside of the poor district knew of the undead corpse running loose through Belhaven's streets. By then, far more had already transpired. Upon digging deep into the archives of the Civic Registry, Senior Clerk Torvin Mallerwick came upon the next stepping stone in his journey to condemnation. The case of Nell Ashrow presented itself with as much convolution and confusion as had that of the late Edrin Velbach. The girl of 9 years had supposedly been a witness to the very boiler accident that had killed Velbach, but records were sparse and seemingly contradictory. Perhaps most disturbingly, Torvin could find no certificate of birth, nor ledger of death, nor any other mention of her existence whatsoever among her civic records. All that was known of her was a note from her school, which stated that she was dismissed from attendance at the institution due to a hysterical fixation. What Nell Ashrow was fixated on so hysterically, however, was not specified in that or any other record. The only other clue Torvin could glean mentioned a separate file from the Sacalomnium, which was not located in the Civic Registry, but a nearby office through the Sacalomnium's eastern gate. Torvin proceeded there at once. He was occasionally seen here at other times for similar work, and so his presence was not looked upon with any suspicion. Upon retrieving the file of the girl, Torvin was shocked at its brevity. There was no record of the typical 8-day consecration ceremony, nor any signed and sealed priestly documentation. Instead, all that remained was a single page of testimony, handwritten with elegant but childlike script. While returning from the Sacalomnium, Torvin broke the seal and read the page in full. It was Nell Ashrow's first-hand account not of the boiler accident that he had been searching for, but of something completely different. The girl's account told the story of how she had noticed that smoke from the nearby factory seemed not to drift with west to east wind, but in various directions. Sometimes it would drift south and settle on the sanctum, or west and alight on the roof of the nearby warden station, or perhaps it would go nowhere but hover over the factory itself and finally fall to the ground, where it would cause Nell to do one thing or another, but always something she knew to be a sin. However, Nell's account was heavily emphatic as she recounted how, most often, the smog would drift far to the west, against the wind. At the end of her tale, the 9-year-old wrote of how she climbed to her factory's tallest smokestack with a stolen telescope and sat to watch as the wicked smog floated west and settled in its entirety upon the roof of the Sacalomnium, gathering especially around the spire where the inner conclave and high sanctum meant to divinely direct the beliefs of Zarathis. Torvin, stunned, had stopped walking, for he had heard the bell again, the same high-pitched ring that he had heard upon discovering Edrin Velbach's documents. He looked around, but, as before, no one else seemed to take any notice of it. Another shock seized upon him just then, and he nearly leapt sideways into the shrubbery, for the moment the bell stopped, the ink from Nell's testimony suddenly melted from the page and fell to the stone floor, where it took the form of 2 small handprints and 2 footprints, as if a child had fallen from the page and landed on all fours. The ink prints soon swiftly vanished from the floor, and Torvin quickly put the empty page back into the file and continued onward. He returned through the eastern gate to the Civic Registry and hid the file from all others. He did not return it this time, for on the back of the page was his next clue, written in red ink. Cleansing order, stayed by warden intervention. See deposition of warden Halbrecht Thornseal, sealed by Fagar authority. Beside this note, in the same red ink, the imitation Fagar stamp glared up at him with the tiny CNS abbreviation clearly included across the bottom banner. No sooner had Torvin hidden the file among the other stacks of paper on his desk than he was summoned by his supervisor, Civic Registry Manager Orden Quill, and told in no uncertain terms to cease his investigation. There was nothing unusual or strange about the stamp he kept seeing, and as he was not a warden investigator, he had no business looking into these cases without senior approval. For the Fagar's authority to close its own dangerous cases was not to be questioned, regardless of the documentation protocols that they chose to follow or ignore. If Torvin did not cease his inquiries, warned Manager Quill, consequences would follow. Shaken, Torvin agreed. The threat, he perceived, was to his career. Worst in his mind at that moment was the return to his family's shop, followed by the admittance that he had ruined the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance no one in all the Malorwick's long lineage had been afforded, one that he had squandered with his inability to obey his superiors, to submit to the authority of the Fagar, who were the very mouth and heart of the divine god they worshipped in order to stay consecrated so that they might enter paradise. So the file sat on his desk, unopened. Within a day, Torvin had returned the page, which, unknown to all, was still blank, but the name of the warden in red ink festered in his heart. In his apartment, sleep eluded him as temptation gnawed at his inner being. While Torvin fought against his darker side, the root of darkness he had unleashed grew into mortal weeds that threatened to choke the life out of Belhaven. The same night as the blank file was returned, the footprints of a child in black soot traveled forth from the holy cathedral of the Fagar, restless and searching. Upon encountering a warden patrol, the full body of Nell Ashrow manifested for a grim assault. A black cloud of smog poured from her mouth, engulfing the armored men, who shed their helmets in panic and left the grounds in a choked haze, crying out, afflicted with false memories of the heinous crimes committed by others of their own brotherhood. As Nell ran and frolicked through the streets, the smog continually belched forth, flowing through doors and windows, filling the cramped spaces and alleys, caressing the skin of anyone it could find. The black dust adhered to every surface, spelling out one sin after another. Common folk priests awoke gagging on the smog that declared their supposed wickedness to the world. Citizens strode through the streets in a daze, reciting with horror long accusatory lists of immoral misdeeds, and each person who spoke or heard the lists remembered committing those same blasphemies, though many had never even heard of some of these transgressions. In the end, the entity that took on the form of a small, frolicking girl covered in soot was hunted down and destroyed by the wardens, who tracked her to the smokestack ward, fought through the miasma of corruption and guilt, and emptied their hand cannons into the fragile body of the dusty thing. Records were completed hastily, though through the Sacalomnium alone, and not with any aid from the civic registry, for this was deemed a wholly moral matter, and the office of the Prime Paragon held no sway over the proceedings. Those laymen and women whose unjust guilt persisted were invited to attend a special consecration ceremony presided over by the Inner Conclave, which absolved each of them of any and all past sins, assuring them that their place in paradise was not in jeopardy for bearing witness to evil's assault on the most holy city in Zerathis. Once completed, all were strongly encouraged to never speak of such things again, as the arcane had no place in the common life of the great city of lights and faith. Despite the earlier warnings, the temptation of the red-lettered warden name proved too great for the likes of Torvin Mallerwick. In less than a fortnight, already he schemed for how to get back into the Sacalomnium to gain access to the forbidden knowledge he so desperately sought. So curious was he to uncover the reality behind these mysterious cases that sleep largely eluded him, and his usual immaculate organization at the Civic Registry began to show uncharacteristic slackness. Fellow Senior Clerk Davil noticed this change but said nothing, fearing for the career, nay, the very life, of his friend and associate. With scrupulous attention to detail, Torvin pulled his weight enough to avoid the notice of Manager Orden Quill, or so he thought as the end of the week drew near. While attending his weekly consecration, Torvin slipped through the throng of devoted followers anxious to receive the divine oracles of the High Sanctum. Within only minutes, he had made his way into the Warden archives. Knowing he would never be permitted to remove the document from its resting place, he had brought alone his own writing tools, eager to copy down pertinent information, which he would conceal within his own apartment to avoid suspicion. In no time at all, Torvin discovered the files he sought, detailing the deposition of the Blessed Warden Halbrecht Thornseal, held closed by the thick wax seal of the Fagar Archival Authority. With shaking hands, Torvin broke the seal on the file, and once more that high-pitched bell rang, coming to his ears as though from just over his own head. Yet again, as he looked around, he saw no one, and it seemed the bell had not brought upon him the undue attention of the consecrated warden archivist. The deposition story was dark and grim indeed, for Warden Thornseal had been sent to dispatch the girl Nell Ashrow for spreading corruption. Yet upon encountering her, the warden had hesitated, drawn into a deception by whatever vile entity had deceived the little girl and caused her to spread lies about the sins of others. In desperation to preserve her for his own unspecified purposes, Warden Thornseal had absconded with the girl and hidden her someplace in Morrowick Lane, a large road in the Smokestack ward in the south of Belhaven between the two southern factory districts. The end result of the deposition stated that Warden Thornseal had been prosecuted for failure through the restraint of unauthorized mercy, but his final fate remained sealed under the same vague CNS authority that predominated every one of these other cases. In describing what had become of Nell Ashrow, the earlier name of the street, Morrowick Lane, did not appear, replaced by yet another vague mention of a market-clearing incident, also sealed under the authority of the CNS. However, this time, it was no offset altered stamp, but a full-fledged wax seal, carrying the weight of the institution whose regulations Torvin had now violated again and again. Torvin's way out of the Warden archives was not as effortless as his way in, for after copying down anything he viewed as necessary, Torvin was confronted by the consecrated archivist, Maverin Goldline, a man with talents and aptitudes much like Torvin's own dwindling skills. Upon presenting his credentials to said Warden archivist, Archivist Goldline informed Torvin that the civic clerk did not possess the necessary authority to rummage through the Warden archives, and that a report would be sent to his manager at the Civic Registry, as well as adding his name and infraction to the access log in case the wardens had any questions for him at a later date. Torvin, wishing to protest this development, nonetheless held his tongue, for he became aware of the presence of 2 armored wardens standing guard at the exit. Rather than cause a scene by uselessly pleading with Archivist Goldline, Torvin instead left between the armored shoulders of the 2 guardian wardens, who gazed long upon him, learning his face and features, which once seen would not soon be forgotten. However, though Torvin escaped from the warden archives unscathed, the same could not be said for the southern districts of Belhaven. As could be predicted by any sane individual following Torvin's investigation, the breaking of the seal on the deposition carried its own consequences. Deep in the smokestack ward's southern reaches lay an unmarked grave, which bore a wooden totem aged with rot and decay that had once displayed a benediction stating, "Here lies a man of honor and duty, sacrificed by greater powers." From this grave burst a hulking armored form given both life and purpose anew by some ancient diabolical treaty whose signatories are yet unknown. This revenant form of once noble warrior crawled, then walked, then crept through the streets of the smokestack ward, armor cracked, the holy insignia of the 3-tongued flame burned black upon his chest, brought forth to pass judgment on those who judge. To this day, it is said that the Revenant lurks in the corners of the southern districts of Belhaven, forcing the penalties of unlawful mercy upon those who obey where they should instead show restraint. In times of controversy and crisis, he drags his blade through warden stations and fires his gun into sanctum doors, demanding that every order be weighed against the face of the innocent soul it condemns. According to modern records, the Civic Complex does not acknowledge the existence of the Merciful Revenant, claiming it to be one of Belhaven's many-colored folktales. Inquiries to the High Sanctum on this matter do not return any answer whatsoever. Torvin Mallowick wasted no time in proceeding with his search for Morrowick Lane, for he had intimate knowledge of the map of the city, and such a street did not appear within the official map, nor in any ledgers Torvin had ever come across. Knowing full well that he would find no mention of it within the Civic Registry, and hoping to avoid the judgment of Manager Quill, Torvin traveled north to the Archival Quarter, where all things within record are kept back to the founding of the city, and thus the district ever expands to make room for more and more logs, files, and storage as Belhaven's history is documented in meticulous and excruciating detail. For a long time, Torvin stayed there, creeping through the vaults and warehouses and basements, straining his incredible mind with page after page, eyes keen and sharp as ever, ears awaiting that fateful bell to assure him of his path. But the deeper Torvin searched, the more encouragement and unease mingled within him. No single file on Morrowick Lane could be found, and so his hunt took him from one seemingly random page to the next, in files that had little to no connection. But Torvin knew it was there, though none else could see it. His mind was fastened onto this single, all-important task, though he knew not why he had been the one to stumble upon this great mystery of the CNS and its many supposed victims. He knew he must be the one to uncover its truth. And so on he went, collecting scraps of records on the street that officially never existed. Each day after his shift at the Civic Registry, Torvin left immediately to travel to the Archival Quarter, entered quietly so as not to draw attention to himself, and continued his perusal of the endless boxes, shelves, and stacks of records. Upon the completion of his search late each night, Torvin crept out of the Archival Quarter and returned to his apartment, where all his discoveries were hidden now under one of the stairs as their contents burned like a hellish fire within his mind and heart. By now, the investigatory file he had constructed on the cases of worker Edrin Velbach, Little Nell Ashrow, and Warden Halbrecht Thornseal included partial tax receipts, arrest records, school attendance rolls, vendor fines, birth notices, and utility logs, all pointing to the past existence of Morrowick Lane, a poor district market street that had seemingly been erased from civic maps and all other official records. Torvin's nights became sleepless as he awoke often, gasping and sweating, clutching at his blankets in fear, the images from his dreams never leaving his increasingly paranoid brain, of wardens kicking in his door, pulling him out of his chair at the Civic Registry, or chasing him down some dark, forgotten alley only to outrun him in their hissing metal armor, pressing the hot gun barrels to his chest and head, making him scream as his skin bubbled beneath them. After visiting the archival quarter regularly for 3 nights, Torvin began to suspect he was being watched and followed, and his movements became increasingly furtive and fearful, though it was not enough to keep him from his prize. Indeed, his desperation only grew alongside his paranoia, so that as he searched through one of the many extensively organized basements, upon placing his hand on the file that held his final answer, the ringing of the fateful bell sent him over the edge in panic, and he fled the scene without even reading its contents. To shake his imagined pursuers, Torvin detoured through the civic complex, passing through the civic registry itself before returning to his apartment by a roundabout way. When he entered his home, he shut off the lights, drew the curtains, and peered at the file using an electric candle under his bed covers. Finally, it was all here. The truth of Morrowick Lane could no longer be denied. The file was what remained of an account of a raid on an illegal, unsanctioned market in the Smokestack Ward, where unconsecrated families could gather to buy and sell anything and everything. Though many of the convicted stated that it was their only means of making a living as unconsecrated outcasts, a statement from a member of the High Sanctum condemned the practice as a clearly deceptive means of inviting the arcane into the city walls. Upon arrival, the wardens had discovered that the market encompassed several city blocks spanning the length of an entire ward, with the market being collectively referred to by the secret traders as Morrowick Lane. In the raid, many had fought back and been slain, stalls had been torn down, and suspicious items had been confiscated. Torvin could hardly contain his emotional outburst as he found a partial list of confiscated items, one item in particular standing out as he read it aloud. Item 47, one brass service bell, engraved along rim, recovered from unauthorized vendor at Morrowick Lane. Transferred under sealed sanctum order to Sacalomnium Registry sublevel, Chamber of Necessary Silence, Bell Door, Desk 3. With great confidence that he had at last found the official name of the CNS, Torvin breathed more easily than he had in many days. He returned to his desk at the Civic Registry the next morning, hopeful and smiling. But his confidence was not to last, for the moment he sat in his chair and greeted fellow senior clerk Davil, Manager Quill urgently took him aside and handed him an envelope bearing the seal of the Inner Conclave. Torvin Mallowick had been summoned to appear before one of the high-ranking priests that very day, and he was instructed to leave work and attend to the matter immediately. With much trepidation, Torvin made his way from his desk, watched by all who had come to know him, the way a man who marches to the gallows is watched with somber silence by friends who know he is guilty, though they know not of what. From the Civic Registry he walked in a daze, crossing through the eastern gate and into the Sacalomnium, following the clearly marked halls until he came to the offices of the Inner Conclave, the priesthood sitting just under the High Sanctum itself. To the office of Senior Priest Father Caldus Whitebarrow, Torvin came, and he sat in the ornate office before the wealthy, divine herald like a guilty child. Father Whitebarrow made no attempt to discover Torvin's guilt or innocence, for the former was presumed simply by Torvin's presence in the office. The senior priest of the Fagar order spoke calmly, paternally, with a disappointed tone. Torvin had known better than to go off on his own inquisition, to take on responsibilities and authority that was not his own. While his initiative had been a godly attribute in the former days, now it was a dangerous thing. For by now the case of the resurrected Edrin Velbach killing his local priest in the Smokestack Ward Sanctum had risen through the ranks and become known among the Inner Conclave. Father Whitebarrow also admonished Torvin for accessing the Warden archives, yet another thing he had known was forbidden. He advised Torvin to cease his inquiries, and he educated him on the reality of seeking forbidden knowledge. Such learning can only lead to discoveries of the foulest kind, for the known world is but a pond in the midst of the great, vast, and dark ocean of the cosmos, and we do well not to penetrate beyond our bounds, lest by our pursuits of the sciences or the spirits we hail some foreign and malign consciousness beyond our comprehension, and thus doom all we know, heedless of the boundaries set by those who understand better than we what awaits us past the fences and guides of law and sanity. This risk, said Father Whitebarrow, was Torvin's undertaking, and it was noted and unapproved. Thus Torvin was passed an official reprimand from the Inner Conclave, a parchment he was required to sign. He did so, and then after some more paternal education on the part of Senior Priest Caldus Whitebarrow, Torvin was sent back to his desk at the Civic Registry, sullen and shaken. Upon his return, the disruption to his organization of his work was noticed immediately. He inquired of the others as to who had been at his desk since his absence, but no one would speak a word, except for fellow senior clerk Davil, who would say only, "The wardens were searching for something." Though Torvin made additional inquiries, Davil would not speak further of the matter. Noticing that his troubled senior clerk had returned, Manager Quill summoned Torvin to his office and conducted a light interrogation of the young man. Torvin's denial of unusual or illegal activity fell on deaf ears, and Manager Quill's suggestion of some time off for his hard-working, accomplished clerk proved to be anything but a true suggestion, as Torvin discovered when he found the requisite form for a leave of absence already filled out and awaiting his signature. This also he was made to sign, dismissed for the remainder of the week. For most in this position, this involuntary suspension from duty would have caused great anxiety. Indeed, only weeks before, such an action on the part of his manager would have petrified Torvin, but the disappointed, disapproving faces of his family no longer filled Torvin's mind. Instead, only the chamber of necessary silence was at the forefront of his thoughts, for item 47, the brass bell, rang in his ears as he departed from the civic registry. It rang once more as Torvin returned home, rang again as he pulled his files from under the stairs, rang a fourth time as he pulled out the map of Belhaven he'd taken from the archival quarter, and it rang a final time as he drew Morawick Lane's boundaries onto the map. After this, the bell was mercifully silent, and Torvin spent a fitful, restless night tossing and turning in his bed. But the silence of the clerk's bell did not signal the ceasing of the turmoil, for that very night, when the clock struck 12, Morawick Lane returned to the streets of Belhaven. Instantly cutting across the smokestack ward like an inflamed scar, stalls stretched across sidewalks and roads too far to be ordinary, tended by ghostly vendors who seemed to speak to all who were present, and also to some who were not. Those who came by in the nightly hours and in the early morning found themselves drawn to these stalls, for the calls of the sellers could not be disobeyed. Unsuspecting buyers returned home or came to their workplaces carrying their purchase with no memory of having bought them, stunned to discover that they had spent their talars on a necklace made from the bones of the Unconsecrated, a jar containing a pair of still-breathing lungs that exhaled sin-causing soot, a burning but unconsumed page on which was written an oath broken by a warden, or even a birth certificate for a child that had never been born but once purchased became a pregnancy in the womb of a nearby woman doomed to never come to term. Most strangely, many stricken buyers came away holding little brass bells, which spontaneously rang in their hands at random intervals, though not when they were shaken. Whether worker, manager, driver, priest, or warden, all who entered Morawick Lane could not leave without buying back something that Belhaven had been required to forget. The civic complex and Fagar High Sanctum convened immediately. They marshaled the wardens to cleanse Morawick Lane and discover the source of this infernal disruption. But though the slow wheels of bureaucracy turned quickly in high places, none could spin fast enough to stem the flood of disaster that had just been loosed upon the capital city. From his bed, Torvin Malorwick heard each ringing bell, and he rose, unable to bear the noise, for it consumed him. In a mad panic, he made his way directly to the archival quarter in the early hours of the morning, searching for any mention of the Chamber of Necessary Silence. Now that he knew the name, it seemed to be everywhere. With each discovery of the name in an obscure file, another sealed crime of the wardens or hidden sin from the Fagar was reopened, and a false memory of committing it flew from deep beneath Belhaven into the mind of one of its people. Citizens awoke that night shrieking with horror. Mothers wailed with the memory of losing children they never bore. Factory workers shuddered as they recalled dying in accidents they did not witness. Wardens groaned over executions they never committed. Priests remembered absolving the guilty of crimes they knew not of. With each false memory implanted, one of the many bells in Torvin's mind went still and did not ring again. Obsessively, Torvin tore through the basements of the archival quarter, afflicting one Belhaven resident after another until every last bell had ceased to ring except for the very first bell, which now rang without fail on the hour. Madly, Torvin dashed from the archival quarter and returned south along the steamway and came to the civic registry. With uproar across the city, Torvin easily followed the noise of the bell as it led him inside. His feverish search in the basements of the archival quarter had given him much, so much that he felt as though his mind would spill from his eyes and ears at any moment. The bell tolled within his skull so that he stumbled into the office like a drunkard, desperate to write down all that he had learned. It must be told, all of it, every crime, every sin, every broken oath. Belhaven would be told. The city would fall, yes, but it had already begun. One more push to send it over the edge, teetering over the side of the cliff of stability and order and plunging headlong, taking its mothers and infants, cargo and coffins, wardens and wealthy, priests and peasants, all the glitter and glamour of the capital hurling into the bottomless abyss of unfiltered truth. But when he returned to the office, the other clerks stood in confusion, some with their own false memories, some seeking to comprehend what had happened in the night. Torvin's eyes bulged with this obsession, and the other clerks avoided him as he sought in vain panic. For among the entire civic registry, there was not to be found a single writing utensil, paper, file, typewriter, or clerical stamp. When Torvin searched his desk, he discovered that another item of import was also missing. His nameplate had been removed from his desk and replaced with a blank one, and his office credentials, stowed neatly in his top drawer whenever he left the office for the day, were also absent. Seeking out Davil nearby, all the other clerks fled from Torvin's presence, and though Davil made as if to flee, Torvin seized him, demanding to know what was going on. Davil, through his fear, revealed that the wardens had been there in the early morning when the first clerks had arrived for the morning shift, that they had been the ones to remove Torvin's nameplate, credentials, and all the writing ability of the registry, and that all in the office had been ordered to alert the wardens at once if Torvin returned for any reason. Indeed, as Torvin looked over to the window of Manager Ordenquill's office, his panicked superior was on the phone, which was used only to call the wardens in case of emergency. No sooner did Torvin realize the game was up than in his head loudly tolled the brass bell, compelling him on. Torvin fled the civic registry, the bell pounding in his ears, and he raced through the streets, taking the main avenue west. He hid among the chaos and cacophony caused by his own inquisitive searching, traveling north along the Sakalamnium's western wall, then doubling back east along the northern wall, exhausted but refusing to stop. Finally, he had arrived at the north gate of the Sakalamnium, the entrance to the Fagar archives. The ringing bell beckoned him inside. Within, he stumbled, panting, desperate, and followed the noise of the single bell that had first assailed his mind. It now rang on the minute and from a direction discernible to Torvin's ears. The more he listened, the less the noise of the bell came as a ring, and the more he thought he heard numbers within the sound. He repeated these numbers aloud like a babbling fool, a directional code disguised as the very archival notation he had spent so long memorizing. The codes were real, Torvin realized, though they made no sense, referring to non-existent descending levels that indicated a place beneath the Sakalamnium archives. Shaking and twitching in the light of his discovery, Torvin seized a nearby traumatized priest by the collar and screamed, "It is the chamber! The chamber! The necessary silence lies buried beneath the liars!" Torvin followed the bell onward, though the priest attempted to restrain him. All that kept the once sane Torvin Malowick from doing unspeakable violence to that priest was the urging of the bell, along with the knowledge that the wardens were surely pursuing him. He had been too public for his trail to be lost to them that easily. Indeed, as he fought off the priest's restraining hands and made for the stairs to the Fagar archives, the hissing metal boots of the wardens echoed off the stone columns and marble walls. He scrambled and fell, sometimes descending entire stairways with naught but his hands and knees, absently taking blows from the floors that he met with his stricken, sweat-covered face. On his path, the bell guided him, but his meticulous mind refused to ignore that which could not be set aside. Rooms that he discerned somehow should not have been in the floor plan for the archives seemed to illuminate themselves at his presence. Correction chambers, vaults of forgotten testimonies, racks of sealed confessions, lighted furnaces into which even at that moment members of the Divine Order threw confiscated documents and files. Stacks of these files, each stamped with the seal of the CNS, waited patiently on small desks beside locked black ledgers for their inevitable destruction. Finally, Torvin found himself at the bottom of the last stairway, and a long hall of many doors stretched on and on before him. The bell lured him onward. It was close, and each door bore its own label. Smokestack Ward. The bell rang, and the name Nell Ashrow appeared in black soot upon the door's surface below its label. Another door down. South Factory District 2. The bell rang. Edrin Velbach's name came into being on the door. A third door, this one on the right. Enforcement. Another ring. Another name. Warden Halbrecht Thornseal. further down, and the revelation beckoned him from the other side of a fourth door. Bell Door. As Torvin went to fling the door wide open, he froze in stunned shock. Upon this door also appeared the name. The name, Torvin Mallerwick. Heedless he entered, for the armored steps of the warden sounded upon the stairs behind him. The rows upon rows of shelves within the chamber held bells of every shape and size. At the end of each row, a simple desk. Torvin searched and found Desk 3, upon which sat a small black ledger. As with all the others, the ledger was locked, but the lock came undone on its own, as the bell rang louder than ever. Upon the first page of the ledger, stamped with the CNS seal, he read, Mallerwick, Torvin, Clerk Irregularity, Unauthorized Inquiry, see Addendum 497. Final silence approved by CNS, awaiting completion. The bell rang, the final time it would do so on its own, and Torvin turned. Item 47, his brass bell, sat before him on the shelf beside the desk. He beheld it and wept, for he saw the final push, the cliff of order, the abyss of unfiltered truth, the means by which all contained within the chamber of necessary silence might be loosed, names restored, mercy justified, the murdered remembered, and damned souls posthumously vindicated. The wardens entered the chamber just as Torvin seized the bell in his hands, determined to finish what had begun with a simple error in the death ledger of an unconsecrated man. According to legend, Torvin rang the bell over and over, eyes black as ink, hands bleeding with wounds that formed from every seal he had opened in his mad search for the abyss, mouth uttering stolen names in a language that nearly tore the world asunder. Different versions of the tale give accounts of what happened next, whether the guns of the warden stopped the disaster before the city drowned in unsanctioned truth, or Torvin simply went mad with the revelations and was destroyed by his own folly. A few tellings say that Torvin fought off the wardens with the corrupted strength of an arcane lich, but these versions are few and far between, and they do not explain how it was possible for the wardens to subdue him and restore order to the city. Perhaps one of these endings carries the power of truth, or perhaps a far worse fate awaited Torvin at the hands of the Fagar Order. For the dungeons of the Sakalamnium are vast, and none know better than the heralds of the divine what happens to a broken man concealed from the sight of God by his own enduring evil. Nonetheless, Belhaven was saved from the obsession of the disobedient clerk. While some records seemed to indicate that his name and the name of his family joined the many others in the Chamber of Necessary Silence, in later years, the story of the Mallerwicks came to light, and an investigation was conducted on behalf of the supposedly innocent shopkeeper and businessman who had been Torvin's father. For the man had grown exceedingly wealthy in his enterprises, and his deep pockets funded the search for his middle son. But no such chamber was ever found, though the Fagar did admit that certain special offices had been appointed in the aftermath to review dangerous cases of an arcane nature. Instead of justice on behalf of the Mallerwicks, the populace and media of Belhaven have learned a different and far more important lesson. That ordered progress is built on the back of necessary silence when matters extend beyond the purview of the common masses. And a good thing, too, for even if the story of Torvin Mallerwick is simply legend, the horror hiding behind it peers out from the tale as a monster lurking within a child's abyssal closet. Not every fact is proved, and those who listen to the unappointed bells risk all. For truth, without sanction, is only another form of darkness. Thanks for listening to my final horror fantasy folktale from the world of my novel in progress, The Decay. Together, these dark legends have carried us across the world of Zarathis, through haunted sanctums, poisoned harvests, forgotten wells, hungry seas, and now the hidden machinery of the capital city itself. Some of these stories were warnings, others were pieces of history, and a few may have been something worse. But the folktales are only the beginning. Sometime soon I'll begin uploading selected chapters from The Decay, where these scattered fears lay the groundwork for a much larger story, and the shadows behind them finally begin to move. Until then, thanks for listening. Tread carefully and test every spirit, for the bell has been rung, and now The real story begins.